Welcome to the Incursion module for Lesson 2, Types and Stages of a Breach, which is part of the Symantec Technical Foundation Security Solutions course. After completing this module, you should be able to define incursion according to the industry standards of today, describe the ways in which incursion poses a threat directly to the customer, understand some of the key tools and techniques used by attackers to gain access to the customer's environment. In this module, we will first define incursion as a breach stage and briefly touch on the general methods for gaining access. In the next section, we will touch on SQL injection as an attack method and explain how SQL injection attacks can be used to perform a number of different activities which compromise an organization's system and data. Next, we will explore the vulnerabilities and exploits which put organizations at risk every day, then move on to talk about malware. In the fifth section, we'll briefly discuss account and password guessing attacks, then end the module by reviewing the key takeaways. When we talk about the incursion phase of a breach, this is where the criminals, hackers, organized crime groups, and even government entities in some cases try to gain unauthorized access to data or system. The criminals are aided by many tools that are readily available that automate and accelerate the incursion. Incursion into an organization's infrastructure is typically accomplished in a couple of ways. First, SQL injection. By analyzing the URL syntax of targeted websites, hackers are able to embed instructions to upload malware that gives them remote access to the target servers. Exploiting system vulnerabilities is another method. In many cases, laptops, desktops, and servers do not have the latest security patches deployed, which creates a gap in the overall security posture. Gaps or system vulnerabilities can also be created by improper computer or security configurations. Cybercriminals search for and exploit these weaknesses in order to gain access to the corporate network and confidential information. Targeted malware is another category. Cybercriminals use spam, email, and instant message communications, often disguised to come from known entities, to direct users to websites that are compromised with malware. We'll discuss different ways that cybercriminals leverage these to infect systems with malicious code. We'll cover all of these incursion methods in this section. This graph, taken from a recent investigation by Verizon Business, underscores a crucial point about incursion. The vertical axis shows the categories that caused or contributed to data breaches that the team investigated. Most incursions involve events that span several categories, so the percentages add up to more than 100%. As you can see, hacking and malware are top contributors. However, if you look at the error category, which is circled in the slide, you'll notice that an error or oversight on the data breach victim's part contributed to 67% of the breaches. In the more successful and costly breaches, the cybercriminal exploited some mistakes committed by the victim. Generally speaking, Symantec have also noted that the majority of breaches occur in part because basic controls were not in place or because those that were present were not consistently implemented across the organization. This can include some basic security policy oversights related to credentials. For example, passwords on internet-facing systems such as email, web, or FTP servers are often left on factory default settings. These are easily obtained by cybercriminals who can use default passwords to, in effect, walk through the front door. Another related item involving identity management involves poorly controlled access control lists on network devices. Under-constrained or outdated ACLs provide further opportunities for both hackers and malicious insiders. If obvious weaknesses are left exposed, chances are the cybercriminal will exploit them. Cybercriminals will likely move on to the next target if they see that some time and effort has been made to shore up blatant security weaknesses. Now that we've defined incursion, let's now move on to look at SQL injection attacks, which are becoming incursion techniques of choice, responsible for the largest data breaches in the past years. In a SQL injection attack, cybercriminals target poorly coded web applications to execute SQL statements in the back-end database. This situation often occurs when applications are not coded to security best practices or when web applications fail to properly filter or validate users' input. Malformed SQL queries can typically flow right through traditional network firewalls because the commands sent during the attack look like regular web traffic. the cybercriminal can ultimately gain access to the underlying database. A typical example is as follows. First, the attacker sends SQL code as user input for a web front end. In this example, it ultimately executes a command to look up user information. It will generate an email asking to change password to the email address of the cybercriminal. In the second step in this example, the target system responds by sending a password reset email. The cybercriminal can next iterate through different user names until he obtains access. The attacker could just as easily have used SQL injection to embed instructions to upload malware. That malware could then provide the cybercriminal remote access to the target servers, a precursor to stealing sensitive data such as credit card numbers. The best strategy cybersecurity professionals can implement to protect against SQL injection attacks is to look for vulnerabilities in the code of web applications, although this is a painstaking process. As part of a multi-stage breach, SQL injection attacks are the foundation for the later discovery and capture phases. By using or leveraging SQL injection attacks, attackers can return usernames that are stored in the database, which can be used for further access and penetration. SQL injection attacks can also return credit card data stored in the database. Cybercriminals can also use the attack as a means to control the database and linked systems. They can allow remote execution of commands that can, for example, install malware on the system. The attackers also enable data extraction, for example, emailing sensitive data out of the database. Let's now move on to another means on Incursion, exploiting system vulnerabilities. In many cases, laptops, desktops, and servers do not have the latest security patches deployed, which creates a gap in the overall security posture. These system vulnerabilities can also be created by improper computer or security configurations. Cybercriminals search for and exploit these weaknesses in order to gain access to the corporate network and confidential information. So let's take a closer look at the problem and some examples. For some context, it's helpful to understand the overall life cycle of a typical vulnerability and the dangerous points along that timeline. Starting on the left side of the slide, at some point in time in the past, a vulnerability is introduced. This could be a security flaw in an operating system or in a web browser, for instance. It could be a simple programming error or an oversight that could have existed for many years without notice. So the flaw remains harmless until discovered. But since the vulnerability isn't known in advance, there's no way to guard against the exploit before it happens. The crucial point in the timeline occurs when hackers or criminals are the first to discover the vulnerability. This is when the window of complete vulnerability occurs. This is depicted by the dark red shading. When hackers or criminals then develop malware or malicious code that exploits the vulnerability, there are no traditional antivirus signatures in force. This period ushers in what's called the zero-day scenario. A zero-day exploit is one that takes advantage of a security vulnerability on the same day that the vulnerability becomes generally known, but before there is a fix or patch to defend against its exploitation. Cybercriminals are becoming incredibly sophisticated at finding new vulnerabilities and exploiting them before the security community can react. Given that it takes less than a second to compromise a single machine, a zero-day attack that exploits a previously undiscovered but widely prevalent security hole can propagate across hundreds of thousands of internet-connected machines within a few hours. Continuing with the timeline, at some point after the exploit, the problem or bug becomes public knowledge, usually by security vendors detecting the malware and targeted vulnerability. In the case of security vendors with antivirus products, the malware detection is added to signature databases. This section is often referred to as the period of partial vulnerability. Some, though of course not all, of the malware that makes use of the recently discovered exploit can now be detected and blocked by anti-malware tools. This is only partial safety. The operating system vulnerabilities still exist and there's no fix for it yet, and new viruses and spyware will be written making use of the same vulnerability and staying one step ahead of the anti-malware vendors' database updates. The last section of the timeline depicts the vulnerability being fixed by a patch or update. This is when the vendor providing the product with the vulnerability releases a patch that fixes the underlying problem. Systems that have been updated to include the patch are now safe from this vulnerability, and malware that attempts to exploit the problem on those systems will now fail to do so. That's why it's so important to make sure the systems are updated regularly in addition to just keeping anti-malware databases up to date. A common way attackers leverage vulnerability is with browser exploits. A browser exploit is a piece of code used to exploit a vulnerability or bug in a web browser. The code may exploit HTML, JavaScript, images, ActiveX, Java, and other web technologies. A web browser is an easy and convenient target for attackers because of the ubiquity as well as increasing underlying complexity. There are more add-ons, more functionality that interacts with the host machine, all of which gives rise to potential vulnerabilities that can be exploited, particularly when users are slow to upgrade to latest versions or apply patches. Unlike worms and viruses, many of the attackers cannot be stopped by antivirus software alone. The attack can be used to exploit to make the browsers do something unexpected. For example, it could force the browser to crash, read or write local files, propagate a virus, or install spyware, or observe and collect sensitive data. This slide depicts just one reason why web pages themselves are vulnerable to exploits. Each web page is comprised of a number of individual files. These can have varying extensions and formats. For example, on the slide you can see references to HTML files, GIF files, JPEG files, JavaScript files, and so on. The ability to parse and process these files is what makes the browser a very complex piece of software and therefore prone to more bugs. A typical home page has about 50 files, many of which can be altered and subverted by malicious actors. Another type of web application vulnerability leveraged by cybercriminals is called cross-site scripting, also known as XSS. With cross-site scripting, attackers can inject client-side scripts into web pages that will be ultimately downloaded and viewed by users as they visit websites. Cross-site scripting vulnerabilities present a direct threat to users of affected websites because they allow attackers to access session cookies. This can allow an attacker to hijack a user session on an affected website, effectively stealing his or her credentials, allowing the attacker to perform actions posing as the user. Cross-site scripting attacks play an important role in more sophisticated attacks because they have the potential to let attackers distribute malicious content through a compromised site. Malicious content can take the form of exploits, malicious code, defacement of site content, or phishing attacks. This can compromise trust in legitimate websites since attacks can originate from sites deemed safe by the security and usage policies of the organization. Their impact may range from a petty nuisance to a significant security risk, depending on the sensitivity of the data handled by the vulnerable site and the nature of any security mitigations implemented by the site's owner. The chart on the right illustrates the severity of the problem. According to Symantec Internet Security Threat Reports, there were 11,253 site-specific cross-site scripting vulnerabilities documented. At the time of the report publication a year later, only 473 of those vulnerabilities had been fixed by the maintainer of the affected website. Another exploit related to cross-site scripting is cross-site request forgery. Cross-site request forgery, also known as a one-click attack or session writing, is a type of malicious exploit of a website whereby unauthorized commands are transmitted from a user that the website trusts. Unlike cross-site scripting, which exploits the trust a user has for a particular site, CSRF exploits the trust that a user has in a user's browser. In terms of the process flow, first the user browses to a page that has malicious content. After accessing the page, a script or link is downloaded and executed in the end user's browser. In this example, the malicious code is able to open the wireless router for outside access by the cybercriminal. In addition, the criminal can receive forwarded copies of email and monitor personal financial actions such as online banking. In the fourth stage, once the firewalls have been effectively rendered useless and the internal computers hacked, the cybercriminal can make use of sensitive information he has collected by accessing private emails and snooping in on transactions. He can then directly access the victim's bank account and withdraw money. Attackers also seize upon feedback provided by web servers. This slide depicts how a typical verbose error message can leak sensitive information. In the circled excerpt, cybercriminals can gain crucial knowledge about the database structure which they can use to exploit other vulnerabilities. These can be helpful information to launch a SQL injection attack. Likewise, information about server headers can leak the exact server type and version, which can help cybercriminals pinpoint applicable vulnerabilities. If you look closely at the circled excerpt, you can see that it reveals that the underlying server is Windows-based. To close on the vulnerabilities section, it is interesting to note that criminals often attack vulnerabilities for which there are known patches. The Verizon risk team found that in the last year, 6 of the reported breaches were made possible due to patchable vulnerabilities. In all these cases, the patches were released for more than a year. Symantec's own research supports this observation. Criminals simply exploit vulnerabilities that exist in the infrastructure. Last year alone, we found almost 5,500 vulnerabilities in infrastructure that companies had deployed that was web-facing. 90% of those have patches that were available for 6 months or more by the time a breach happened. So in a lot of cases, the vulnerabilities list that the application and security vendors produce are a how-to guide in terms of how to break into companies. Malware, short for malicious software, refers to software designed to infiltrate a computer system without the owner's informed consent. This is many times synonymous with computer viruses, a catch-all phrase that often includes all types of malware, including true viruses, which we'll discuss. More precisely, malware is a category of malicious code that includes viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. Destructive malware will utilize popular communication tools to spread, including worms sent through email and instant messages, Trojan horses dropped from websites, and virus-infected files downloaded from peer-to-peer connections. Malware will also seek to exploit existing vulnerabilities on systems, making their entry quiet and easy. In terms of definitions, viruses are self-replicating pieces of malicious code that attach to an application program or other executable system component. They almost always corrupt or modify files on a targeted computer. A worm, by contrast, is a program that makes and facilitates the distribution of copies of itself, for example, from one disk to another, or by copying itself using email or another transport mechanism. A Trojan is malware designed to look like a normal program that gives or allows remote access to a system or installs a payload. Bots are programs that are covertly installed on a targeted system, allowing an unauthorized user to remotely control the computer for a wide variety of purposes. We'll cover bots in a little more detail shortly. Malware is typically involved in a lot of breaches. In years past, malware was generally delivered in the form of self-replicating email viruses and network worms. The primary goal was rapid and widespread propagation, typically resulting in availability losses and extensive cleanup. In the last 5 years, these goals have shifted. Malware is now an essential component to nearly all large-scale data breach scenarios. Hacking gets the criminal in the door, but malware gets him the data. Naturally, the criminal will then want to minimize the chance of detection in order to maximize the amount of data stolen. For this reason, malware becomes ever more directed, innovative, and stealthy. Malware will typically contain a payload used by the cybercriminal. For example, we have rootkits. These are programs or collections of programs that enable administrator-level access to a computer or computer network. They also have the ability to hide the presence of the malware or toolkit. Sniffers are another common payload. They are used to capture data on the network. Keyloggers, similarly, are used to track and capture user input on the system, and backdoors are used to gain future access to the system. With the increasing sophistication of cybercriminals and their attacks, it is quite easy for end users to get infected by malware. There are some obvious ways. This would include clicking on an email link in a spam message, visiting a high-risk site, installing an infected executable that appeared as an attachment in email, or clicking on a link from an untrusted source. Then there are some slightly less obvious ways. This can include clicking links at a trusted site, inserting a USB drive into a computer, having a weak password that a cybercriminal could guess, or having a vulnerability present. Then we get into the scary scenario that is becoming more common, simply visiting a trusted site and getting infected with malware. It's no surprise that social networking sites are becoming a prime target for malware attacks. And a larger targeted category of sites includes not only social networking websites, but also other related leisure sites, such as online gaming sites, forums, blogs. They all offer a sense of trust, popularity, and community. These are typically more likely to include activity on sites that may be vulnerable to attacks. Seizing on the trust, popularity, and community characteristics of these sites, cybercriminals attack social networking sites with a vengeance, making them one of the most attacked categories of websites. A typical user who frequents these sites is often lulled into a sense of security and fooled by messages and offers purportedly from those in his or her network of contacts. The user will often click on such a link or open an attachment without realizing the repercussions. In sum, it's an effective vehicle for infecting a large set of individuals, both consumer and enterprise. A key technique to attack users who visit popular sites is known as a drive-by download attack. In effect, just by visiting any website, a computer can be silently infected. Drive-by downloads require no user intervention to work. All that is required is visiting an infected website. Drive-by downloads exploit vulnerabilities in software that runs through the web browser. This can be the browser itself, in other words, Internet Explorer's JavaScript or HTML rendering engines. It can also target media plugins such as Adobe PDF, Adobe Flash, QuickTime, Windows Media Player, etc. Also, ActiveX controls and other examples of custom applications by third-party developers. The damage due to drive-by downloads are exacerbated because customers often have no patch strategy for third-party applications. Drive-by downloads, in fact, work best when they exploit a user's trust relationship with a site. We mentioned earlier how attackers are targeting social networking sites. Drive-by downloads work best when hosted on these trusted sites. These tend to be the most visited sites, which equates to high traffic. People expect that they're safe if they stay on known sites, and that provides a great opportunity for cybercriminals. All this combines to make drive-by downloads a primary infection vector. This slide depicts how a typical drive-by download works. First, the hacker inserts malicious URL. Next, the web user visits a legitimate website. Third, the user is redirected to a bad website controlled by the cybercriminal. And fourth, the bad website sends obfuscated threats that attacks vulnerabilities to take control of the user's system. In the fifth step, malware is installed without the user noticing it. Finally, malware sends private data back to the hacker. Let's move to the topics of bots and botnets. A bot is a type of malware which allows a cybercriminal to gain complete control over the affected computer. When a large number of bots are controlled en masse, they are known as botnets. They are used to automate operations that cannot otherwise be done. Some of the famous botnets that we've seen is RUstock, first seen in 2006. The infection estimates are about 1.3 to 1.9 million machines, and this is still responsible for around 10% of all the spam worldwide, with about 11 million messages a minute. The Storm botnet, Trojan.pcom, first seen in January of 2007. There's some very wildly varying infection estimates with this, between 250,000 to 50 million infected machines. And this is another one that's largely used for sending out spam email. And the configure threat, or the W32.down@up, first seen in November of 2008. The infection estimates are about 12 million machines for this one, currently around 6 million machines. We mentioned in the previous slide that a bot is a type of malware which allows a cyber criminal to gain complete control over the affected computer, and that bots operated in mass are referred to as a botnet. A few more terms are helpful to know. Bot herders are the cyber criminals who control the botnet and run what's called the command and control network. The command and control network itself is often distributed over many servers. Using an Internet Relay Chat or HTTP communication protocol, the network can instruct the bots on the infected machines to perform actions. These actions include downloading software, sending spam, remotely controlling operations, and setting off denial of service attacks. For example, StormNet was reported to have several million enslaved computers reporting to it at one time. Bot herders will rent out these zombie computers for criminal use. The newer botnets are self-defending and have built-in countermeasures against attempts to take them down. For example, they will perform denial of service attacks against researchers. They will also often encrypt and or obfuscate their traffic to deter analysis and prevent theft of botnets from rival bot herders. They also change IP addresses rapidly to defeat IP blacklisting attempts. Botnets operate primarily out of a financial motivation. Access to the network is typically sold for various purposes, as we can see on this slide. According to data from Symantec's Message Lab division, botnets that leverage a huge network of infected machines in which individual computers send a low volume of spam are responsible for 87.9% of all spam. Distributed denial of service attacks is another use. This is where an attempt is made to render computer resources unavailable to its intended users. This is done by flooding the computer with more data or requests that it can handle, and in a distributed denial of service attack, more than one computer is used in the attack, which makes it an ideal application for a botnet. Recent attacks brought down infrastructure in South Korea. These attacks originated from botnets. Botnets are an integral component for phishing campaigns. In a typical attack, potential victims are identified. The botnet will send fraudulent emails that appear to come from a legitimate organization like the victim's bank, and then the data harvesting stage begins, where the cybercriminal retrieves usernames, passwords, and oftentimes bank account details. Click fraud is another application for botnet controllers to make money. This is a type of internet crime that occurs in pay-per-click online advertisements, such as those offered by Google. Botnets are employed to imitate legitimate users clicking on an ad, thereby driving up the commission income for those hosting the ad. Finally, online extortion is also aided by botnets. The cybercriminal controlling the botnet makes it clear when the attack will happen and how much it will cost the company in lost e-commerce. The company will then pay to stop the attack. Let's move on to the final incursion method that we'll cover, account and password guessing attacks. Many hacking attempts start with an attempt to foil or crack passwords. This usually starts with finding a valid user account and then trying to guess the password, either by manually typing in the password or using some sort of password guessing tool. A key contributing cause for some of the major recent breaches can be traced to mismanagement of identity. As we noted earlier, default and shared passwords were often used to compromise the environment. The existence of default or weak passwords represents a significant risk because it allows cybercriminals to gain quick access to systems. Cybercriminals can employ password guessing attack tools to automate local or remote password guessing attacks. In addition, sniffers can also be used to look for user account information traveling around the network if the data is not encrypted. Once the cybercriminal has this information, he or she now has access to the system. Depending on the user account that they compromised, they might also gain high-level privileges on the system, enabling them to install malware. Discovering usernames, for example through a valid account determination vulnerability, is half the battle. There are also other password discovery techniques that cybercriminals employ. First is the guessing attack. This approach leverages knowledge about the target and related personal information to aid in the password discovery. The attacker will perform research on the target and attempt to use common passwords that use victim names, pet names, social security numbers, birth dates, favorite bands, high schools, a user's login name backwards, and so on. Dictionary attacks are another approach. Users' passwords are typically weak and consist of words and names that are easy to guess. Many of them can be found in a dictionary. Cracking tools and malware will use a dictionary to try to guess a user's password. And a third approach is a brute force attack, which is a method for breaking a cipher. In other words, the attack attempts to decrypt a specific encrypted text by trying every possible key. The feasibility of brute force attacks depend on the key length of the cipher and on the amount of computational power available to the cybercriminal. In this module, we discussed what incursion is and what some of the means of incursion are. Now let's consider the key takeaways within the context of each learning objective. First of all, incursion describes the second discrete stage in a data breach. It's when criminals or unauthorized parties try to gain access to data or a system. Next, we learn that there are many threats posed by incursions. Some examples include the resource drain due to spam and denial of service attacks, sensitive data loss of credit card or personally identifiable information, and more. We also discussed the more prevalent methods of incursion using SQL injection attacks, vulnerability exploits, and malware examples.